All right. Okay, so Anna Kasparian, host. I think isn't she also like the editor in chief at this point? Of the Young Turks. I guess showed up on Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire and on his YouTube channel, and they had like a sit down, just kind of interview format. I have no idea how this went. We're gonna do it at like 1.25 just to save a little bit of time, but let's go. Let's just get into it.
Democrats, stop focusing on scaring people about the scary right-wing candidates and offer them real solutions that you're going to fight for. I think that's the only long-lasting winning strategy for Democrats. Are they going to do it? No, because they're captured by the money.
October 2021 was the first time I met Anna Kasparian for our debate in the Pennsylvania Chamber of...
Ben, I can't. He talks too damn fast. Okay, fine.
Commerce.
Life expectancy in Finland is much higher than the United States.
No, you're correct. Hold on.
It's only 78 years.
No, you're correct. The life expectancy in Finland is longer than the life expectancy in the United States. That's not what I said. I said the life expectancy for Finnish Americans is longer in the United States. That is an apples to apples.
We thought it was a great discussion, and in this episode...
Is that an apples to apples comparison? Finnish people in the United States, Finnish people in Finland? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're Finnish. It matters if you live in Finland.
Anna and I are picking up where we left off. Many listeners will be aware of Anna from The Young Turks. That is the flagship news show from the Young Turks Network, or TYT.
Man,
where Anna
oh
is the producer and a co-host with Cenk Uygur of a daily evening broadcast on news, politics, and culture. The show has over 5 million subscribers and 6 billion views on YouTube. It is the longest-running online news show.
Yeah.
And TYT is arguably the most successful, openly left-wing alternative news media company, operating as a hub of progressive anti-establishment programming. The Young Turks started as a radio program in 2002. It transitioned to YouTube in 2005.
Man, holy shit. This is, you know, it's funny. We watched that like Vosh and Brianna Joygray like thing last week. This is like leagues and bounds more good faith at the beginning than that ever was. Wow.
Anna came on board in 2007, playing an integral role in the network's success. Anna and I disagree seriously on a lot of our beliefs and opinions, but both of us enjoy good old-fashioned conversation about ideas with people we actually don't agree with. In our episode, we discuss many of those disagreements, but importantly, where we can also find common ground. We have some honest back and forth on healthcare reform, labor unions, and manufacturing, the left-wing policies that have been a complete disaster for California, and grading the current Democrat and Republican parties.
Oh boy. Oh my God, dude. Like, Christ above, Christ above, Christ above.
Hey, and welcome. This is the Ben Shapiro Show Sunday Special. I'm really excited to welcome to the program Anna Kasparian. Anna, thanks so much for stopping by. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So first of all, we have to take on the elephant in the room. You are braving grave danger coming on a show like this one. So what's prompting you to actually join me on the show? Because it is hard to get people who disagree.
I give Anna a lot of credit. She is like more than willing to like show the fuck up and like defend her values and defend her policy prescriptions, and I respect the fuck out of that.
On shows like this one, for sure.
Well, I think that it's important to talk to people you disagree with, debate and hash out some of the ideas that we have and the differences we have. I'm not afraid of my political views. I'm not afraid to admit when maybe I got something wrong in the past and maybe I've evolved on my political views. It's just really, really important in a functioning democracy to have Americans see one another as fellow Americans as opposed to an identity that needs to be super combative with a different identity. And I think that's what we've kind of turned into. You and I clearly have a lot of disagreements on policy, disagreements on culture, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're an awful person. It doesn't mean that I should be afraid of you. If anything, I should prove that I genuinely believe my political views by engaging in these debates.
Nobody should be afraid of Ben Shapiro. Let's be very, very clear. Ben Shapiro is about as intimidating as ultra soft like toilet paper. That's about as intimidating as Ben is.
If I can defend what I believe with actual facts, statistics, empirical evidence, well, that only proves that there's good reason to believe in the policies that I'm promoting. And it's easy to be in an echo chamber where everyone already agrees with you, but you're not really being challenged. So I like to be challenged. I like to put my political ideas to the test, and I think this is a good opportunity to do it.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I really like about you as a person. We actually got to know each other when we did a debate about a year ago, I think,
Yeah.
over in Pennsylvania, and we were talking in the green room beforehand.
That's a good debate.
And
I
we
watched
got
that.
along as human
Not on
beings.
stream,
And
though.
one of the
That's
things
when I
that's
was a
nice about
private
conversations
citizen.
like this is, again, what you say I think is super important, which is that the social fabric of the country is going to be built on the idea that people can have conversations
Right.
like this, and yet it's considered so unusual and so crazy. Have you gotten any blowback for being willing to do conversations like this one?
I have. I will say, it is a small portion of a very loud group of self-identified leftists on Twitter, for instance. They'll get very upset. They'll accuse me of platforming you, even though, I don't know if they noticed, you've got a bit of a platform on your own. I don't need to help you in building a platform.
I hope they
or
didn't. I hope
platforming
that
you.
people didn't
I
bitch
think
about
that
this.
There's
Like,
this very
Nobody
real
understands
fear
platforming,
that in
apparently.
engaging in these conversations, you are legitimizing the other side. And my point is, as long as the other side's coming at me with good faith arguments, they genuinely believe what they're saying, having these debates is important in actually deciphering what you as the viewer believe, right? Because if you're only listening to one side, if you're listening to leftist media, liberal media, and you don't get the other side at all, your policy ideas are never going to be challenged. You're not going to hear the other side. And I think it's led to this culture right now where Americans overwhelmingly seem to have difficulty with nuance, right? Everything needs to be black and white. And honestly, political issues are usually a lot more complex, a lot more nuanced, and nothing in life is black and white.
And that's what makes them interesting in the first place.
Right.
If it was all that black and white or that easy, you wouldn't have to listen to shows like yours or shows like mine, and you wouldn't have to. I've always encouraged people to listen to shows that are on the other side of the aisle, because otherwise they don't know what I'm saying that's fact and what I'm saying that's opinion. And so I think it's really important for people to hear conversations between people who really, really disagree. You used a phrase there that I think is really important, good faith. And this is one that I've had to kind of think through myself, because obviously there are conversations that are not worth having. You'll have people online who will say, you should go talk to this person. This person happens to be, like dregs of the earth. And then you say, well, I don't really wish to talk to, and they say, well, you say you're willing to talk to pretty much anybody. So how do you draw that line? How do you draw the line between somebody who is worth talking to, somebody who's acting in good faith, and somebody who's not really acting in good faith?
Well, I think the interaction that you and I had both before and during that debate was really important to me in that it gave me a better idea and sense of who you are. One of the issues I've had in recent years is the characterizing or the caricatures that are drawn of the other side. And I think the left does it, the right does it. So just kind of like lumping you in with, let's say, Tucker Carlson, lumping you in with, I don't know, someone else that I certainly don't think is coming at these debates from a good faith perspective.
Matt Walsh, possibly. If we want to talk about like somebody who is very contentious, and I think somebody who, like, I'm willing to bet even Ben thinks goes too far sometimes. I'm willing to bet that Ben kind of sees how contentious he is, would be Matt Walsh. Like, Matt Walsh is on the same network, and Matt Walsh says some fucking vile shit that I think Ben Shapiro even knows he can't get away with. And I don't even think stuff that, like, I think he would actually cop to. But, like, Matt Walsh does do JQ posting, so there's also that. So, I mean,
They're looking for clicks. They're
the
looking
call
to
is
build their
coming from
public
within the
persona.
wire.
There's a lot of that going on. You're a pretty respectful person when we're engaging in these debates. I don't really see you trying to draw caricatures of me as we're in the middle of these conversations. So to me, that's important. You can just tell there's like toxicity, and then there are people that you disagree with politically, but you can actually have a respectful conversation with them. And because I had that experience with you, I was comfortable, again, having this experience today in hashing out our differences, but also talking about where there might be some similarities, where we want the country to go, because this country's always had a variety of political ideas, political differences, but there was a time in America where people could engage in these
So
debates,
far, I like
engage
this,
in these
though.
conversations.
This is, at least from a, I'm going to play a bit of team sports here. At least from the offset, Anna is doing an incredible job of coming to this with a lot of good faith. And I think whatever the opposite of poisoning the well would be, she is like curing the well. You know, like Anna's coming to this in a way where I don't think she like people who are watching this in Ben's audience are not going to have the ability to write her off as like a triggered liberal, or even a crazy progressive, or any of the other caricatures, because Anna's coming to this with a lot of respect and a lot of, I think, professionality, which is good. It's very, very good. There's an aspect of it where it's like, well, you shouldn't have to come with it with this much of it, and some people might be like, might be kissing ass a little bit. No, this is a good way to push back and get in with, I mean, Ben Shapiro's a huge audience. Like, Anna's going to change some minds, or at the very least have them second guessing some things, probably based on how she's setting everything up. So good for her.
And leave feeling that mutual respect for one another, seeing each other as fellow Americans, as opposed to my enemy, the other side. We need to, crush them. We need to do that. I want to move away from that. And honestly, during the coronavirus pandemic, I've opened my mind up to some programming that I otherwise wouldn't have listened to. So, for instance, there's this show called The John and Ken Show. It airs in LA, but I think it's actually syndicated all over the country. And I like listening to it because there are a lot of perspectives in that show that I disagree with, but there have been moments where one of the hosts will say something that in the short term I might be offended by or angry about or whatever, but I have to do my due diligence. So I'll investigate it a little bit and think to myself, oh, well, actually, he had a point there. So I think the necessity for nuclear energy is a good example of that. Once I realized
nuclear
right
energy,
now, the technology for renewables isn't quite where we need it to be, where we can just give up fossil fuels and be okay. Well, a good clean energy solution to kind of close that gap, at least for now, would be nuclear. And you say that, and a lot of people on the left have a negative reaction to it. But I think it's partly because they're not typically exposed to other perspectives. Everyone's kind of...
I'll be 300. I don't know fucking anything about nuclear energy. If a scientist were to tell me, like, actually, it's, like, perfectly fine, like, what happened, like, the nuclear energy in your mind conceptually is that of, like, 50 to 60 years old, if not older, like, the technology has advanced, we're in a much better place, then I'd be like, then, okay, if that's... because we've seen like kind of the I remember there was like that reactor breakdown in what was that, maybe like 2008 in like Japan. I forget where it was. Where was that? Was it Okinawa? No, I don't know what city it was in, but yeah, you see stuff like that, and that really like puts you off, because it's like, ooh, I don't know about that. Now I'm like kind of nervous about it, but like even then I'm like, again, I don't know the science enough around it, but like I've heard that it's something that it's like, yeah, like everyone's, when they think nuclear, they think Chernobyl. It's not like that anymore. The technology has advanced. This is what I said, where you got to grow and you got to learn. You got to, it might not feel right to you at first, but should probably investigate it a little bit.
In their own ideological bubble. It's a huge problem, in my opinion, and that's why I want to have conversations.
I mean, that's a great example. So I've always used nuclear energy as actually the litmus test on people who take climate change seriously. There are people on both sides who don't, right? There are people on the right who will say that it doesn't exist, that there has been no global warming over the course of the last 100 years, or who say that there is no anthropogenic global warming. It's entirely the fault of the sun. And my perspective has always been, I don't have the expertise to challenge the IPCC when they suggest that there will be a certain amount of climate change. Their sort of outlying, more extreme predictions are the ones that have sort of the least predictability, and they admit that. And so the question becomes, what do we do in order to prevent as much of this as possible while still maintaining a lifestyle that Westerners are used to and that we should aspire to for the rest of the world? And nuclear energy has always been a great way of doing that. And so that perspective has tended to draw fire from both sides. You have people who say, well, why are you even acknowledging that this sort of thing is, you sound like Greta Thunberg? And then you'll have people on the left saying, well, how he doesn't even believe in global warming because he is advocating for nuclear energy. that sort of failure of nuance, I think, has really deleterious effects because it prevents us from accomplishing solutions. That
Anna also picked a good
thing. It's a pretty good.
Anna really picked like a good starter too,
thing because we disagree on so many things. And if we can agree on something like nuclear energy, then really there's not that much to argue about.
And I mean, nuclear energy does not emit the type of climate. Emissions, climate-causing emissions that other fossil fuel, oil, natural gas, that definitely does have an impact. It contributes to the climate emergency. So anyone who is against nuclear energy...
Also, this might be like an idiot talking and somebody who doesn't understand it, but also it always seemed like kind of a bad idea. And kind of like on the face of it, like if you thought about it, it's like, oh, we're extracting like oil out of the ground. To which you have to ask yourself, like, wait a minute, what function did that serve while it was in the ground? Like we use it to lubricate cars and like to do and to fuel stuff and everything else. But you also have to wonder, like, what is it doing in the ground? I don't actually know. That's kind of my assumption, is that it's mostly serving as kind of the bloodstream for a lot of things on the earth. But I'm like, it couldn't be good if we dried out the rest of like our earth, like by like extracting all of these what's the word I'm looking for, resources. Like it's like that just doesn't sound like a great idea. I understand why we do it, but like, at least like intuitively that just doesn't sound like a great idea.
I think there are some points that are legitimate. So for instance, people are concerned about another Chernobyl. I totally understand that, but the technology has improved since then, better safeguards.
Not run by the communist Russians. Yes.
Yeah. But look, these are conversations that should be had, and we should be fearless in having these conversations. I feel
you can't have 1950s fears for 2023 technology.
But
that's kind of also the thing, right? Like
basically a culture that leaves ego aside and helps people feel comfortable acknowledging when, hey, maybe I didn't get something right. Because there are certainly areas where turns out I didn't get something right. I used to be 100% against nuclear. I thought nuclear would be super dangerous. I totally bought into like the Chernobyl
3 Mile
related.
Island. Yeah, exactly.
But once you start reading into it a little more, once you actually start thinking for yourself independently, independent of some ideological model that you're supposed to fit into perfectly, it really does open your horizons, and it allows for you to learn. And that's what I want to do. I want to learn, and I want to make sure that the information I'm getting to my audience is well thought out and accurate.
So, I think what's really interesting about that is that it seems like there are two values that you're centering in on, and they're working in tandem, which are really good. One is that you're actually pursuing things that you think are true. You're trying to get to the truth, which means listening to other perspectives, just from a sort of classically liberal position. And then on the other hand, you're also suggesting that this builds social fabric. And so the point that I've made is that the future of the country, in terms of sort of a national polity, because what we're seeing right now is a giant sort, right? We're seeing people like me move to Florida, away from California. You're still in California. We'll talk about that.
I thought Ben lived in Nashville. Does he live in Florida?
In a second, you're seeing people in New York get more New York, and people in California get more California, and Florida get more Florida. It's getting redder. And so the social fabric at the national level seems to be fraying a lot. And so one of the things that I've said is that the future of the country is going to rely on people who disagree with me, but agree that we should be having the conversation.
Right.
Not siding with people who they may agree with in terms of the political end goal, but foreclose the conversation. Because that way, the social fabric phrase, you get to where you want to go, maybe, but you lose half the country in the process.
You might lose half the country in the short term, right? But I think media is incredibly powerful. And look, I think it's also important to differentiate between what you and I are doing and what I see happening on other, let's say, right-wing shows, right? I see a lot of right-wing hosts bring on individuals who purport to be on the left, and then all they do is come on the show and trash the left while simultaneously agree with whatever the
Dave Rubin, a leftist.
Right-wing host is saying, right?
Jimmy Dore, a leftist.
It's a form of propaganda that I think is persuading some amount of leftists to immediately panic if they see someone on the left go on a right-wing show. So I'm sure that they'll see this conversation, they'll automatically assume, oh, Anna's just there to...
welcome to the Republican Party, Anna.
Right, to reinforce what Ben is saying. But you and I have serious differences. We've debated economic issues. Everyone can go back and watch that debate that we had at the Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce. But at the same time, I think there is a difference between the endlessly I don't want to say sometimes violent, yes. Like, we just need to bring the temperature down for a second and acknowledge that the majority of the country isn't on the extreme right or the extreme left. The conversation is dominated on social media, especially by the extreme right and the extreme left. We need to bring the temperature down and actually represent what the majority of Americans are concerned about. Majority of Americans want the same thing. They want healthy, happy families. They want financial stability. How do we get there? And we're never going to answer that question if all we do is pretend like the extreme ends of the spectrum are representative of this country and that we should all hate each other and be super divided.
So in a second, I want to talk to you about the incentive structure for avoiding exactly kind of the thing that we're doing right now. First, it's time to talk about Daily Wire's most trusted privacy partner and the premier sponsor.
Oh my God. Wow. You almost got me there. You almost got me there, Ben. Oh, wait. Is it over? Okay, it is over. Okay, cool.
All in the industry nutpicking. You try to find people on the other side who say the wildest possible things, or you take them out of context so they sound like they're saying the wildest possible things, and not having conversations like this. One of the things that I'm seeing, it's what to get started. So let's talk about the incentive structures in not having conversations like this. One of the things that I'm seeing, it's what we would call in the industry nutpicking. You try to find people on the other side who say the wildest possible things, or you take them out of context so they sound like they're saying the wildest possible things, and then you critique that in order to drive up ire. And I think all of us do this. I mean, we're all in the media, which means you very often are playing a 20, 30-second clip of somebody. It's not a long-form conversation like this one because they're just different formats, and we all get this. I think the audience
what's
also
the
needs
views
to
on this
understand
thing?
that's a thing that happens. What's more dangerous is when that, I think, carries over into the
265K
political
views?
sphere, where you have people in each political party who are now attempting to draw and actually incentivize the other party to get more extreme. The idea being, what if we make the other party so extreme that they are unpalatable to the majority of the American people? They elect us, we win, we get to do what we want. Now, that in the short term actually may get them some wins, right? I think this is one of the things that happened in the 2022 election, particularly in the Senate. You saw some Democrats who are actually supporting the most kind of out-of-the-box, crazy Republican candidates like Don Baldock in New Hampshire.
Luckily, this video actually did pretty well, so that's good.
In the primary,
it's reassuring.
In order to elevate him, thinking, okay, well, that means he's going to lose, which is exactly what happened. It's actually quite smart strategy in the short term, but what it also ends up doing is it ends up fringing out the moderates, meaning like everybody who is not on the fringe is now not represented in the election. And what you've ended up doing is incentivizing the kind of most angry part of one party, and in your own party, making them the most angry that they could possibly be about the other party, as opposed to, what if we all just sort of pick our best candidates and then let them go at it in the ring?
I mean, I wish that was the actual method and strategy, but you would actually have to have a campaign strategy that offers the voters something to vote on instead of something to vote against. And I think that this has actually been an incredibly dangerous strategy for the Democratic Party, because they might feel super confident that their candidates can beat someone who's on the extreme right. But there have been instances where that wasn't the case. I mean, certainly in 2016, the Democratic National Committee was really propping up Donald Trump under the assumption that there's no way Hillary Clinton would lose.
Yeah, like the idea is like, all right, we're gonna like push forward the most like craziest person, and then like our side's gonna be like, holy crap, we need to like really get them, you know, we really need to like vote against them or whatever, and it's driving people to vote against other candidates instead of giving them a positive message. Yeah,
lose to Donald Trump. Well, here we are. I mean, Donald Trump won clearly. So there's that part of it. I also think when you consider the campaign donations that ordinary people give to the Democratic Party, they were not under the assumption that their hard-earned money was going to go toward far-right candidates in order to, you know, give these Democratic candidates a leg up in their mind. I mean, again, it's very, very risky to do that. I don't think it's a smart strategy at all. For the Democrats, even in the short term, again, it's risky, okay? Sometimes they get it wrong. And if you don't give people something to vote for, meaning if you don't have policy proposals, actual solutions that are appealing to voters, are they going to show up just to vote against the person you've been fear-mongering about? I don't think it's smart at all. Aside from that, I think what you're saying is also correct in that the conversation increasingly becomes dominated by lunatics. And I don't think that's representative of most Americans. And there's also this problem of lumping in everyone together in like this neat little box of ideology, right? So I think in the minds of a lot of people on the left, you are the exact same person as Tucker Carlson, right? And I think you're different. I think you're different from Matt Walsh. I think you're different from Candace Owens. You guys are all on the same network. I commend you for having differences of opinion on the same network. And I'm sure it can be uncomfortable at times, but there are nuances and differences. And I think it's important for people to be cognizant of that, because I don't want to be lumped in with someone on the far left, right? I have significantly different opinions from them on certain matters. And I think it's important to know what those differences are and not let, again, the extreme ends of the spectrum represent the entire country.
So, one of the things that you mentioned there is the idea that you have to run on something, not run against something.
I feel really bad. I'm like hardly saying very much, but Anna's doing like such a fucking good job. She's just doing an excellent job.
And obviously, negative campaigning is the most effective form of campaigning, despite all of the happy talk about how when you campaign for things, people rally behind you. People who are policy wonks tend to do very poorly in elections. People who are attack dogs tend to do very well in elections, because that lizard part of our brain that senses threat is really activated by a perception of threat on the other side. Well,
that's also political education. Americans just have a very poor political tool, in my opinion. We're just not taught, I think, very well how to understand the systems, understand the processes, and then understand political ideology. I think, this is at least my opinion, I think they should be teaching more poli-sci type stuff in high school, or at the very least that should be an option for people, to kind of get that kind of education. But even then, our basic civics classes need such an overhaul. I went to a good county, I lived in a good county. I went to school in a good county, and even then our civics was just okay. It was the most boring fucking class ever, because there's just not really, they didn't figure out a way, at least when I was there, to make these actual subject matter interesting.
Well, actually, can I interrupt you on that?
Sure.
Because I agree and disagree. So let's go back to 2016. Because with 2016 several years away, we can now really analyze it for what it was. Donald Trump's campaigning certainly had a significant negative component to it. Negative campaigning was part of what he did. But he also offered, or at least paid lip service to, something that Americans were concerned about, which was bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States, really taking care of workers in our country, maybe reconsidering some of the foreign aid that the federal government shells out. That appealed to his base, so much so that even today they're so loyal to him, regardless of what he does. So he actually did give people something to vote for. Whereas all we got from the Democratic Party during that election was, ooh, Donald Trump's dangerous. Isn't he so dangerous? Oh my God, don't vote for him, because if you do, you'd be racist, this, that. It was just nonstop scolding. If that is what your strategy is, I don't think that it's a winning strategy, sometimes in the short term, but certainly not in the long term.
So that does raise the question as to what you think the Democratic Party should run on.
Right.
So the Democratic Party has radically shifted its appeal over the course of the last 15 to 20 years. If you go back to 2004, it was John Edwards running on sort of the Two Americas platform, which sounds a lot like sort of the language that Bernie Sanders uses when he talks about the United States, right? A lot of what he talks about is this sort of class divisions in the United States. It's very much focused on economic redistributionism, focusing on the blue-collar worker. This is obviously the audience
Love
that
all
he's
these
attempting
things.
to drive out to the polls. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party, if you look at it demographically, seems to have become the party largely of upscale white liberals who went to college and low-income minorities. And that's a very fragile coalition, because the truth is that I'm not sure that those people have tons and tons in common. Well,
also the problem is you have people who are much more class conscious, who understand that white rich liberals who went to college and just have professional managerial jobs, they are not they don't share a class interest with somebody who works. As a good example, somebody who's an investment manager, maybe a stockbroker or something, right? Somebody who's a stockbroker, they don't own the brokerage or anything. They're still just an employee. They still work for their labor, but nonetheless are absolutely in a different class than I am. As a managerial worker, they operate at a different power relationship than I do. I'm just a fucking cook. I'm a line cook, man. I just make food. That's it. Order comes in, they want food, I make food. Like, that's really about it. In my class, objectives, my class perspective is going to be a lot different than like some stockbroker. They're going to have a much different way of how they see the world is functioning, how the economy is functioning, if it's working for them and if it's not working for them. As a like line cook, the economy does not work for me. We don't get paid very well. The work is usually very high demand and very arduous. It's very physically demanding. So our bodies are breaking down. You know, I know people who have like a ton of burns, a ton of scratches, a ton of cuts, a ton of all this stuff, and they're like 5 years younger than me. You know, they feel 35 when they're 25. I feel like 30 at 30. And that's because like they've been working in that industry for so long. I've been working like a little bit less, but less enough that like I've been isolated from some of the more extreme impacts of that. But like somebody who's a stockbroker doesn't have any of those problems. Their back doesn't hurt from that, anything. They don't have burns. They don't have scratches. They don't have cuts. They don't have slices. They don't have any of this stuff. So like, you know, when they think about like how they want society to function, they're coming from a completely different perspective and a completely different set of class goals.
Upscale liberals tend to be very concerned with questions of equity far more than people who are actually low-income minorities, like by polling data. The sort of woke concerns that everybody on the right likes to pick on, that is white upper-crust liberals who are pushing that. That is not minorities who are pushing that sort of stuff. I remember having this conversation with Van Jones, and he was totally agreeing with me. He's like, what are all these white upper-crust liberals doing talking about this sort of stuff? They should be talking about sort of the bread and butter issues. And so you have the white upper-crust liberals pushing that.
Well, it's kind of hard to pay attention to all that stuff when you're like at the bottom of society.
Policy ranging from abortion to transgenderism to same-sex marriage and those sorts of policies that are not the chief concern of low-income minorities. And it seems like the way that they're getting low-income minorities to sort of resonate to the message is with the threat assessment of the Republican Party. The Republican Party is racist, they don't like you, they hate you, Donald Trump's evil, and all the rest of that. It seems like they dodged the bullet in 2022, but that's a very fragile coalition.
Well, I see this as a problem, honestly, on both sides, campaigning on both sides. I think that increasingly you have both parties completely captured by campaign donations from wealthy donors, corporate donations. I think that's been a problem. That has led to pro-corporate policy by both Democrats and, I mean, Republicans have always been in that camp. But now Democrats have been so captured with that money. And then the other thing is, Ben, it's a huge problem that we have members of Congress invested in individual stocks that they are legislating about or legislating on.
Anna fucking loves this topic, and it's a good thing because it's a fucking winner. Everyone understands that's not good.
Because, first of all, that there's an insider trading issue there, number one, conflict of interest. And also, they're going to want their stock portfolios to perform well. So are they going to pass the right legislation to protect the consumer, to protect the worker, to protect the average American when they are literally invested in ensuring that those companies do real well because they profit off of that as well. So that is a huge problem. And so what you have now is both sides, in my opinion, campaigning on a bunch of BS, okay? Not actually focusing on what would improve this country for Americans, what would improve this country for the voters. It's just nonstop distractions. I mean, look, this is what we're seeing right now with the investigations in the House, right? The first thing Republicans said was, we're going to do investigations into Hunter Biden. We're going to investigate this. Fine, do the investigations. I don't really care, right? I'm not some loyalist to the Bidens at all, by any means. But the culture war stuff, the investigations, it's really important for Americans to understand none of this stuff at the end of the day is going to improve your life, okay? So all the distractions, we need to be privy to the fact that they're distractions, and we need to get back to actually hashing out what policies need to pass in order to make sure that Americans are thriving.
So this does raise the question for me of localism versus sort of national policy. So when you point out, for example, that both parties are subject to regulatory capture or that they're subject to their own stock portfolio, you know, some people would say, okay, elect better people. We need to, if we just elect people of this party, it'll fix it. If we elect this guy, he's going to fix it. And then there's the sort of Thomas Sowell position, which is it's not a problem of people, it's a problem of incentive structures.
Yes,
incentive structures in Congress are just broken.
Yep.
And when you have this number of people, 435 people in Congress, who are controlling this amount of money and this amount of regulatory power, that will corrupt, right? I mean, you put that much power at the hands of a very small cadre of people, whether you're talking about in the executive branch, in the regulatory state, whether you're talking about people in the legislative branch.
So I think where he's drawing this line is incorrect, because he's thinking that the corruption comes from the position that they're in. I don't think that's how that works. I think the order in which where he's including the corruption is incorrect. Where politicians are corrupted is not when they get into office. It's not when they get into office and they start legislating. Corruption comes very early on, when they are given campaign contributions if they want to win their seats. You see, they're also given money through the DCCC, as an example in the Democratic Party. Obviously, this happens on the Republican Party. But they're given money by the DCCC, which is handed out by wealthy donors and super PACs and everything else. So, like, when they get that call from a donor, they're told, "Hey, they donated about $50,000 to your campaign. You should probably take this call." And they take that call. And that person, if they want to win their race, will, they don't need to tell them. But, like, if you're a candidate, you've got to win your race again in like 2 to 6 years, depending on which branch you're in, right? So, like, do you risk not bringing it, not having as much campaign money as the last time you ran, the last time you won? Do you risk losing your seat because of that? Or do you, maybe you don't agree to hold up higher wages federally, but maybe you just don't support it super openly, or maybe you're just not as big of a fighter as you used to be, maybe, around that specific issue. It's a way to just kind of like incentivize people to, like, hey, look, like, if you want to keep your seat, then you gotta give me a reason to donate to you again, or you can't expect this donation again. And if you can't expect this donation, it might go to, who knows, maybe they'll primary you. They'll just bring somebody else in who will play ball. We have to fundamentally reprogram the way we run elections in this country. But the fact that it's in the hands of the government is not the problem. The problem is that the government has been captured by corpo interests.
It's innately going to tempt them to enrich themselves and self-serve and self-heal. I mean, this is something that the founders actually were very much focused on, which was the idea the federal government was going to have very little power. And so this does raise the question of how much power you think the federal government ought to have. Because if we're talking about, kind of the solutions that get implemented, I'm a big fan of the idea that California ought to be California and Florida ought to be Florida, and basically that may be the only way that California and Florida can share a nation is if they are allowed to do what they want in their own particular purviews. But we, because of nationalized social media, and because of the amount of power that's in the federal government, we focus
you also
on the
need
federal
a
government.
national standard,
About what happens on the federal level every single day. If you went back 200 years, no one cared who the president was because the president didn't have that much power. So what do you think of the idea of sort of delegating power back down to the states instead of centralizing back up into a central government that does have the capacity to be used by both sides for corrupt purposes, for example?
It depends. I mean, I think that
what Ben fails to understand is that local corruption, like local government, is so much easier to corrupt than federal government, because you're working in such a smaller pool. Any like corp or organization that funnels money to federal campaigns is going to spend less money funneling that money into state races. Those are much cheaper races. Like Coca-Cola, as a good example, could buy multiple states worth of House seats, of lower court seat, like any of these corporations can easily influence local government very easily. It's all very cheap. It's like it's a lot more cheaper down there. It's a lot easier to get into those markets and to flood the space with money. Federal elections are harder. They've figured out how to do it, but it is going to be hard. It's not going to be harder to do that with local state governments. It's going to be easier to do that with state governments. Much easier.
It's funny because I've always been super focused on national politics, but over the last several years, I've been a lot more honestly fascinated with what's happening in California. I think for obvious reasons, local politics is fascinating to me. And in terms of what impacts my day-to-day life, I've realized that these local decisions have more of an impact than what's happening on a federal level. There's a lot of gridlock and a lot of nonsense happening on a federal level. So I think that's part of the reason why it's not coming down to impact our lives on a daily basis. I think the federal government should be tasked with important regulations to protect the consumer, because greed is a thing, okay? The fiduciary responsibility to shareholders is real. And so how do you balance that with the need to protect workers and consumers? I think you need a federal government and a regulatory body to focus on that.
And you also don't want these states setting up in basically like you would want that to be like a federal standard, because the same way like with wages to a degree, mainly because you don't want these companies, organizations, whatever, to move to basically weak legislated states, like weak regulatory states, and everyone's setting up shop in everyone's headquarters is like addressed in Delaware because Delaware doesn't pass any fucking laws for regulation. Meanwhile, they operate in every other state, and also they shirk a lot of the local and state regulations because they're like, oh well, we actually operate in like a different state. Like, you need to have those sorts of things to be a 360-degree spread.
When it comes to civil rights, you need that protection on a federal level. You can't just leave it to the states. You don't want one state to say, nah, we're not into interracial marriage, we're going to ban that. Or we don't want to, have equal rights based on, or equal rights for everyone. Some races we like more than others. You need a federal government to protect civil rights. But I do agree with you that Americans have not been paying enough attention to what's happening on a local level. There are certain things that can be dealt on a local level that doesn't need to be the responsibility of the federal government. And to be quite honest with you, with all the dysfunction and gridlock with the federal government, I think more and more people are relying on a local level to get policy passed that they desperately need.
So in a second, I want to talk to you about local politics versus national, because I think that the national politics does lead to extraordinary polarization, whereas, as we'll talk about in a moment, when it comes to local politics, everyone gets a lot more moderate when they're talking about their own particular
That's very
community.
true.
First, the debt ceiling is now above $31.4 trillion. Inflation is still well above 7%.
Oh my God, wait, what's
People
happening? What's happening? Wait, how are we doing an ad? Okay. Wow, I don't even know how they got to that. Wow.
About the sort of conflict at the federal level, and federal politics tends to bring out, I think, the worst in people, mainly because it feels like, okay, for me, I'm a Floridian now, which I'm very happy about. People from New York keep trying to tell me what to do. Why can't they leave me alone, leave my children alone, leave my life alone, leave me alone? If you leave me alone in my community with people who I have chosen to live with, which means that we are going to have much more commonality of interest, we're going to come to a policy that works much better for me and my family than people who live 1,000 miles away and who don't know me, don't know my family, don't care about me. And I think that, that return to localism may be the only way forward for the country. I want to talk to you about what's happening in LA. So obviously, I grew up in LA. I spent my entire...
I'd be curious to see what he's talking about, because when it comes down to it, if it's like, Ben would probably be the type of person who's like, I liked my neighborhood before like the gay couple moved in there. But like, that's not really an excuse to be like, okay, gay people can't live in your like gated community. Like, I like you have the right to live wherever you want. You don't have the right to dictate that other people can't live where you live. Like, that's just kind of, that's kind of like, that's the what's it called? That's the old like your freedom ends where my nose begins. Your freedom to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. Like, it's kind of one of those things.
Entire life in LA until 2 years ago, when I picked up my entire family and moved over here. Now my parents live here, my in-laws live here, 2 of my sisters live here. There's been a mad rush to Florida, particularly by people who are sort of the red state mentality. But I don't think it's purely about like I needed to be in a conservative area. Again, I lived my entire life only in blue areas, whether it was Los Angeles or Cambridge, Massachusetts, when I was in law school. And so the thing that drove me out of California is, I think, one of the things that you've been picking up on and getting a lot of flack from your own side for picking up on, and that is that LA has just become a trash heap. I mean, it's been governed awfully. Forget about who's governing it.
Right.
The policies that have been used to govern it are just terrible. You have an increase in crime. Homelessness has taken over the streets. And when I was living there, I mean, I've pretty famously talked about this. And it was the kind of place where I had a very nice house in a pretty decent neighborhood, and we had a gate in the front. And we would open the gate, and there would be a homeless person face down in the gutter, Edgar Allan Poe style, or there would be a guy outside the house shooting heroin into his foot, and I've got like a 5-year-old. And this sort of stuff has become incredibly common in LA. You noticed it, and you've been getting all sorts of flack for it.
Right, because when there are problems in society, we need solutions. And you can't find solutions unless you acknowledge what the problem is and then properly diagnose it. So my biggest issue right now, at least with the way the left has handled the discussion on homelessness in places like Los Angeles, is there's this housing first mentality where, oh, everything would be fine as long as we put everyone in housing. And by the way, let me just note, housing is an important component to this. There is a housing crisis. There's a lack of inventory. I think we all know that. We do need to build more housing. But at the same time, treating the homeless population as if it's a monolith has been a complete failure. There is a huge mental health crisis happening in this country. So people with severe mental health issues are just left to die on the streets. And in some cases, you know, because they are experiencing an episode, they could carry out some sort of act of violence and assault someone. And it's a dangerous situation for everyone, okay? The people who are just trying to go about their day and the person who is left on the streets battling with this untreated mental health issue. There are people who are obviously struggling with drug addiction. And you look at the number of overdose deaths and it has skyrocketed. The approach that we have implemented is clearly not working. More people are dying. And I get so much flack for saying this. I want an actual solution. It is insanely cruel to watch people die on our streets and then give yourself a pat on the back because you think you did something compassionate. That is not compassionate. You know, there's this insanity right now where, let's say we're talking about the same person struggling with a severe mental health issue. They're living on the streets, asking them if they are willing to take the housing that's offered to them. But they can, okay, someone who has a severe mental health issue, I know the left would argue if they engaged in some sort of sexual act with someone, the person who engaged in that act with that person with the mental health issue took advantage because that person with a severe mental health issue does not have the ability to consent. But somehow we're just going to take their word at face value when it comes to housing. No, we need to get that person help. They need.
Wait. Have people been okay? So I'm not super sure what the critiques against Anna have been. I know she's like talked about this, but I haven't watched TYT. I don't watch TYT like as often as I used to. But like, if you're in a situation where you have like this huge homeless population, like, yeah, you should probably house all of them. Like, there's quite a few people who like Anna's making a good point where it's like, well, you can't just like ask them and be like, hey, like, would you like housing or do you want to like stay on the street? And it's like, well, like, first of all, would it not be a wonder if somebody was like, nah, I'm good. I got my little spot right here with my box. I'm totally solid. Like, I'd be like, okay, no. You need to go to the you need to go to the one where we you need to go to like the extra nice one. We need to like really give you we clearly need to pull you back into an understanding here of like, you know, living conditions. But yeah, like, I get what you mean. It's like, yeah, like we can't do this. Like, would you like, you know, we have like a place for you. Would you like to go there? No, I'm okay. Like, no, we should probably be like, okay, everyone, let's go. We're going to the place. You're gonna get a small apartment, shower, and all the rest of that stuff, and da 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 da. Like, I can see the argument for that because it's like you want people to have autonomy, but like they're homeless at this point. Like, and you're not sure how much these people are capable of making that decision for themselves. Also, who makes that decision anyway? Who chooses to stay on the street? Like, that's kind of a cause for concern, would it not be? Like, we're not talking about nomadic people. We're talking about people who, like, their lives probably fell apart. They're like victims of drug addiction. Like,
help.
You kind of need to step in on their behalf to a degree.
People think I am for saying that. It's just common sense. It really is. And denying that the problem exists is the other part of this, right? Denying that there was definitely an increase in crime in big cities drives me crazy. I was assaulted in my own neighborhood. I shared the story. I was shocked at the kind of reaction I got from people who I typically agree with politically. Took my dog out for a walk. Two guys who were clearly on something. They appeared to be homeless, were walking by me or behind me as I was bending over to pick up my dog's mess. One of the guys grabbed me by the hips and started thrusting at me with an erection. And I know that I wasn't raped. I get it. But at the same time,
That's not the standard.
Something.
I've seen. Anna has shown her husband too. I think he's like a fireman. Woof, woof, woof. Brave motherfuckers. I'll tell you right now. I'm sure Christian, her husband, was like, "Let's get this done." Like, oh man, I'm surprised those guys are still walking the earth.
Something like that for a woman who does not have the ability to defend herself in that moment. I had no weapon, no nothing. I have to think about that at least twice a day when I take my dog out for a walk. It is traumatizing. Yes, I've gone to therapy about it. I'm working through it.
That's not your personal problem. That's because you were assaulted. Yes.
What's making it worse, though, is that I'm the bad guy for sharing this story and saying, hey, we can't just let this kind of stuff happen. We need to find real solutions for it.
It's utter insanity to me that has become a matter of public controversy. And this is why I say that when people in their communities see the problem, there should be broad-scale agreement. But you do have a cadre of people who live in a lot of these cities, and I will say in blue cities particularly with crime, who are not affected by crime because they're not living where you live.
Yep.
Which you live in a fine, I mean, where you live, I know that area well. It's where I lived most of my life. It's a fine area, but it's not up in the hills, right? I mean, It's not up in Malibu. And it's not at Barbara Streisand's estate where she's got armed guards outside. And so those people who are really spending a lot of money and making policy and deciding on no cash bail and all the rest of this kind of stuff, and we can't. It's an aspect of freedom. We have to have the ACLU suit to make sure that the police are not allowed to remove people's stuff from the street because it's an aspect of freedom to be sleeping on the street. And the fact that those people are so disconnected from the concerns of everyday life that it becomes a sin for you to mention the consequences of their policy is so dangerous because how else are you going to adjudicate whether the policy is good or bad if you can't talk about the consequences of the policy?
Well, let me give you another example. This happened recently, and I was really happy to see it because it's...
I'm worried that Anna's going to catch a lot of extra needless flack for this segment going forward. I definitely feel like she doesn't I think she's made a good point, and so far I think she presented her point in terms of like California and their decisions in terms of homeless and everything in a way that I think is addresses the nuance and also has a thoughtful comes to it with a thoughtful mind. But I definitely feel like people are not going to like that answer.
It's important for these groups to speak out about what they're experiencing in California. So members of the NAACP in the Bay Area, and we're talking about the NAACP, they're starting to speak out because they don't feel safe. They don't want their children to walk past, people smoking meth, injecting whatever, taking, fentanyl and all that. They want the city to be a lot more proactive in doing something about this because they feel that the communities that are overwhelmingly impacted by this happen to be poor minority communities. And that is true. So you can't, on one hand, pretend like you care about these communities, you care about equity, you care about all of this, when the policies that you are promoting and advocating for are making it incredibly difficult for their children to grow up in safe neighborhoods, clean neighborhoods. I mean, we're spending in California billions of dollars every year on making the problems worse. Our schools need more funding. I mean, it is insane. What we're seeing right now is insane. I don't care if anyone gets mad at me for saying these things. If you're not living it, if you're not experiencing it, if you're not seeing it, and if you've chosen to ignore members of the NAACP on this issue, then maybe you need to, reevaluate what your values are.
And one of the things that's happened also with regard to the crime issue in Los Angeles, which again was a significant moving factor in my family leaving the state, was the attempt by politicians and the media to pretend away the problem. It really is a serious issue. And there have been reports, Los Angeles Times reported on this, about the police actively downgrading the level of crimes when they report them. So what used to be a felony is now considered a misdemeanor. What's considered a misdemeanor is no longer considered a crime.
This will blow your mind. In California, domestic violence, for instance, is not considered a felony. And I'm talking about domestic violence including strangulation,
Ooh.
is not considered a felony right now.
Jesus Christ.
Child trafficking in California, believe it or not, has been downgraded to a misdemeanor. How does that make any sense? And so a lot of the voters, I think, had the best of intentions. I was one of those voters where I voted for propositions in California that I felt were needed to essentially reform our criminal justice system, because mass incarceration is a problem. You know, there are all sorts of issues in our criminal justice system that need reform. But at the same time, I had no idea that when it came to, let's say, cashless bail or things like that, they were going to downgrade certain felonies to misdemeanors. I had no idea, right? So when that's part of the equation, I think it's important for voters to be fully informed on that so they're not surprised later. You get what I'm saying?
For sure.
Violent crime is violent crime. Okay.
Do you think people are going to wake up to this? And if so, how does that incentive structure work? So California is essentially a one-party state. Los Angeles is essentially a one-party city. Even if you're a Republican like Rick Caruso, you have to run like a Democrat in order to even get a share of the vote. So what are the alternatives in cities like this? So, I mean, you're obviously somebody who disagrees with a lot of your party on some of these issues, or at least the more radical wing of your party on some of these issues. You know, I've always considered myself a conservative, not a Republican. So there are situations where I've said I'm not voting for this candidate because this person does not meet with sort of my minimum standards for who should hold office, or this person is somebody who I did vote for, but now I'm unhappy with them. So how malleable are...
I wonder if Ben's going to vote for Trump the second time, or I guess the third time technically. That'll be interesting to see.
For example, how you vote in a local election or even a national election.
Well, I mean, I don't know if malleable is the right word. I was very unhappy with local elections in 2022. Didn't feel like there were really a lot of good options. So that was depressing. And you're right in that California has become so blue that like any idea that challenges what the Democratic Party believes there is immediately disregarded. And I think that that's a shame, because even if I disagree with that point of view, I think it's important to have the debate, right? So I actually really enjoyed watching Karen Bass debate Rick Caruso. I thought that it actually forced her to acknowledge some of the weaknesses in her policy proposals and her ideas. And I don't know, I mean, I'm seeing her make some moves that I like. So hopefully she continues in that direction and she improves LA. I'll wait and see what happens before I really give my full judgment on that. But I think the most important thing to do is for media figures to start having their viewers feel comfortable having conversations with people they disagree with, really, because they're not getting the full perspective. If they're relying on left media, they're getting one perspective and they're not hearing from the other side at all. And when they do hear from the other side, they're hearing from the extremes saying insane, lunatic stuff, and they think that that's representative of everyone on the right. And I don't think that's necessarily true.
The thing that they tell, like at the end of all YouTube videos where they tell you to like click on one of these like things to watch more videos. Yeah, I've been meaning to film one of those. So that's what I was doing. I was just setting it up to film one.